On the morning of 15th November 1892 at 9 o'clock, 42-year-old Dr. Thomas Neill Cream was led to the gallows at Newgate Jail in London. He'd been convicted of murder by Justice Henry Hawkins, who described him as a diabolical character. Neill or Cream had been born in Glasgow on 29th May 1850. When he was around 5 years old, his father took the family to Quebec in Canada. Following his education, he was apprenticed to a shipbuilding company, but the work didn't suit him, so he returned to his studies, entering McGill College in Montreal in the autumn of 1872. He graduated with his medical degree with merit on 31st March 1876. During his time there, he lodged with Miss Porter in Mansfield Street. He had a human skeleton in his room, which he said was for his studies, but just before he was leaving for a holiday one autumn, he placed the skeleton on his bed. 2 days after he left, fire broke out in his room. The door was broken down and the blaze extinguished. When the charred remains were found, it was thought to be Cream's. A few days later, he returned to Mansfield Street. He'd been insured, but the insurance company questioned this. However, the claim was settled via arbitration. In 1876, Cream seduced the daughter of a hotel keeper at Waterloo, Flora Eliza Brooks, but she fell pregnant. He decided to carry out the abortion himself. The young woman became very ill following the procedure, and the irate father of the girl threatened to shoot Cream if he didn't marry her. This he did, but the day after the wedding he hightailed it to Quebec, deserting his new wife. That same year he turned up in London and began studying medicine at St. Thomas's Hospital. Meanwhile, back in Canada, his wife contracted bronchitis and died of what was thought to be consumption. The doctor, however, couldn't help but wonder if the medicine Cream had been sending his wife from England had had something to do with her demise. In 1877, he sat an exam so he could enter the Royal College of Surgeons, but failed. In April 1878, it was believed he gained entry to the Royal College of Physicians and the licentiate of the RCP at the University of Edinburgh, before returning to Canada that May. In May 1879, the body of a girl was found at his premises in Ontario in suspicious circumstances, which damaged his reputation, and his business began to fail. He left for Chicago, but here again he found himself in trouble. He performed an operation on Julia Faulkner, although some sources refer to her as Mary Ann, in 1880, which resulted in her death, and he was arrested, but later acquitted due to lack of evidence. In December that year, one of his patients, Ellen Stack, died from a prescription Cream had written for her. He put the blame squarely on the pharmacist and tried to blackmail him. The pharmacist handed over the letters to the police, but no charges were brought against Cream. In October 1881, he was convicted of the murder of Daniel Stott. Cream was having an affair with Stott's wife, Julia, and the two conspired to kill Stott by poisoning him with strychnine. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Illinois State Penitentiary, but served 10 years and was released. Using his inheritance money from his late father, William, he returned to London in early October 1891. He found lodgings at the Anderton Hotel in Fleet Street before finding permanent lodgings at Lambeth Palace Road, and on 6th October he met Elizabeth Masters at Piccadilly Circus. He accompanied her to her lodgings in Hercules Road, then took her to a music hall. They then met one of her friends, Elizabeth Day. Cream set up a date with her, which Masters told her friend Day about, as she was so excited. They sat by the window waiting for him, but he never appeared. Instead, he'd met his first victim. He'd accidentally bumped into Matilda Clover, a 27-year-old prostitute, and accompanied her home. Masters and Day followed him. Around a fortnight later, Clover received a letter at her Lambeth Road home to meet Cream outside the Canterbury Music Hall. Later that evening, she was seen in the company of a man fitting the description of Cream, and they entered her home. An hour or so passed, and he left. Then the girl left, returning later, seemingly drunk. She was alone and went straight to bed. Half an hour later, her screams were heard by the lodging house servant. She rushed up to help the girl, who was writhing about, although had managed to get her head stuck between the bed and the wall. The writhing and screaming continued, and only stopped briefly when she was exhausted. She asked to kiss her 2-year-old child, so the servant brought the child to her. This went on for 6 hours. The doctor arrived at 7 o'clock in the morning, but having been told by the landlady she'd been drinking heavily the night before, he treated her accordingly. At the trial, he admitted she was in a critical condition, and when called for an hour later, had referred her to another doctor who failed to appear. She died soon afterwards, and was buried in a pauper's grave a few days later. The death certificate cited her drinking as the cause of her death. A few days later, Cream asked his landlady's daughter about the girl who died in Lambeth Road. Sometime afterwards, he wrote a letter to Dr. Broadbent, an eminent physician, accusing him of murdering her with strychnine, and tried to blackmail and extort money from him. This led to his partial downfall, as the only person who could possibly have known she was poisoned was the poisoner himself. Broadbent took the letter to the police, but nothing was done. In early January 1892, Cream paid a flying visit to Canada, having become engaged to a young woman called Laura Sabatini. In April he returned to London, and soon after the city was captivated by the story of a further 2 deaths from strychnine poisoning. Both 21-year-old Alice Marsh and 18-year-old Emma Shrivell had been prostitutes that Cream had written to. As they were suspiciously similar to the death of the 19-year-old prostitute Ellen Donworth, this raised enough suspicion about the death of Clover to have her body exhumed. It was found that, like Marsh, Shrivell and Donworth, she too had succumbed to strychnine poisoning. The net was closing in on Cream. He'd openly bought capsules. He'd associated with these women, and he tried to force a woman called Louisa Harvey to take 2 pills, but she was suspicious, so didn't swallow them. There was also his letters accusing innocent people of the poisonings, and he had an intimate knowledge and interest when news of the girls' deaths had been made public. He also boasted about his association with prostitutes. The officer in charge of the Lambeth poisoner investigation was Inspector John Bennett Tunbridge. He was smart, methodical and thorough. Every scrap of evidence was looked at, and soon he had Cream in his sights. The pair met after Cream made a complaint through his solicitors, Waters and Bryan, that he was being followed and had been interviewed several times by the police, and it was becoming harassment. Robert Anderson, the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, used Cream's complaint to have him questioned once more. Tunbridge arrived at Cream's lodgings on 29th May at around 11 o'clock in the morning, on the pretext of the complaint. He tried to steer the discussion towards the poisonings, but Cream refused to be drawn, so Tunbridge left it. However, Cream went on to show him a bottle of pills from his sample case. The label showed these contained a small amount of strychnine. When Tunbridge left, about an hour later, his mind was made up. He'd found the Lambeth poisoner. Cream was originally arrested on a charge of blackmail before the rest of the evidence fell into place, and he was formally charged with the London murders on 13th July 1892. At his trial at the Old Bailey, which began on 17th October and lasted 5 days, Cream's defence was that the prosecution had failed to connect all the evidence in the chain of events that resulted in these women's deaths. Cream was confident that he would be acquitted of all charges, right up until a day or two before the end of the trial. But the judge, in his summing up, told him to be prepared for the inevitable verdict. On hearing this, his bravado and confidence melted away, with his anxiety clearly visible to the jury. Cream was found guilty of the murders. The judge described his crimes as cold-blooded cruelty and of unparalleled atrocity. There was little public sympathy for Cream. The night before he was due to be hanged was spent restlessly, while he was closely guarded constantly. He was woken at 6 o'clock in the morning and ate a light breakfast. The prison chaplain, the Reverend George Merrick, then visited him to offer some comfort, and at 9:15, the Governor, Lieutenant Colonel Everard Millman, the Under-Sheriff, Frederick Metcalfe, and James Billington, the hangman, visited the condemned man's cell. He was then led to the pinioning room, where he was bound with leather thongs. He was quiet and did all that was asked of him. Then, led by the chief warder, Scott, and followed by the chaplain, hangman, governor and police surgeon Dr. Gilbert, Cream made his way to the scaffold. He never said a word and was hanged. In his will, dated 23rd December 1891, Cream had left everything to his fiancée, Laura Sabatini. He stated that she had brought him happiness he'd not known before. It had been witnessed on the 7th of January 1892. However, the day before he was hanged, he revoked this will in his prison cell and left his estate to his solicitors as compensation for the expenses they'd incurred during their defence of him.